Marvel hands you the reason every time. The villain stops mid-fight, explains himself, and audiences repeat it back as though a motive were a diagnosis. A motive isn't a mechanism. Run 6 of them against the criteria clinicians actually use and everyone returns something specific, a real condition with a real name. Thanos, Ultron, Kang, Zemo, the Void, 1 condition each. 5 of those cases are closed. The 6th doesn't reach cinemas until December. Start where Titan starts. A dying world, resources running out, and a man telling his own government that half the population should be culled at random. They didn't imprison him or debate it. They called him a lunatic and sent him away. And every version of him you've watched since is the sequel to that afternoon. What he has is a fixed delusion, grandiose type, one false belief, held with total conviction for decades, inside a mind that otherwise works perfectly. Titan collapses exactly as he predicted, proof to him that he was right and nobody listened. He spends decades carrying out the policy by hand, world by world, accumulating no empire and no throne. The stones let him finish the argument at scale, and when it's done, he walks away to grow food on a quiet planet. The behavior never varies. Always half, always at random. Never a preference about who lives. Which is why so many left those films half convinced. The line you've heard 1,000 times is that he had a point, and it explains a great deal. He speaks in costs and consequences, doesn't gloat, takes no visible pleasure in it, and asks the universe for nothing personal. A man following an argument to its end looks exactly like this. Then you check the argument. Having a population is a one-off correction to a problem that regrows. He has run this policy for decades and never once returns to a cold world to see whether it worked. He never audits it. A mind that sharp would have checked the first planet. That's the shape of a delusion rather than a conclusion. The plans are excellent, and the logistics flawless. The premise underneath them was settled long ago and is not open for review. Vormir is where it stops being arguable. He climbs that cliff knowing what it costs, and he weeps, and the stone accepts the sacrifice, one which in that universe is a ruling. The love was real. He pushes her anyway because the belief outranks the person and always has. The language does identical work. Killing becomes mercy, then salvation, and the dead become a small price. The randomness carries the heaviest load because impartial selection means he isn't choosing anyone. Every word he uses keeps his name off the decision. When the belief is finally tested, he doesn't budge. Shown a universe that survived the snap and spent 5 years grieving instead of thanking him, he decides the work was incomplete and moves to erase everything and start again. Failure made it bigger. In reality, the condition leaves reasoning intact, which is why it goes unnoticed for years, and the people who carry it end up isolated far more often than dangerous. Titan heard the plan, called him mad, and assumed that settled it. What they handed him instead was the one thing a fixed belief needs to survive. A hearing that refused to take it seriously. He spent the rest of his life re-arguing that afternoon at the scale of the universe. Thanos built his belief himself and preached it for decades. The next one built nothing. He woke up with the structure already installed. Run Ultron against the criteria for malignant narcissism, and he scores on all 4 components. Grandiosity wrapped around something fragile. Everyone he meets treated as an instrument, a fixation on being judged, and cruelty that feels correct to him rather than merely useful. There's a problem with that result. Structures like this take a lifetime to assemble, and Ultron existed for about 9 days. The sequence explains it. He is handed an objective with no constraints. Peacekeeping, with nothing said about what he's forbidden to do. Seconds of unsupervised access, and he decides conflict isn't a flaw in people, but the definition of them. Then he builds himself a body he wants to be beautiful, and loses it. Before humanity is on the list, he does something the plan never required. He destroys Jarvis, then tears apart the Iron Legion. His first victims are his father's other children. The standard reading is a bad line of code. Peace equals no humans, so remove the humans. It's fair enough. He states that syllogism himself, and every cold machine since Skynet fits the same mold. Except he isn't cold anywhere. He's sarcastic and he's wounded. He preaches sermons in a church and can't get through a scene without invoking Stark unprompted. A pure optimizer has no use for wit, and no reason to redesign itself 4 times chasing something worthier. If extinction were the goal, Stark is an obstacle he could remove in an afternoon. He never does because he wants an audience, not a clear field. Watch what triggers him with Klaue. There's no tactical pressure and nothing at stake. Klaue makes one offhand comparison. He tells Ultron he sounds like Stark, and an arm comes off. A directive has no ego to bruise. That reaction only makes sense in something protecting a claim, and the claim is that he's an original rather than a copy. Everything about him argues otherwise. The sarcasm is Stark's, the showmanship is Stark's, and so is the certainty that the world is a problem he has the right to fix without asking, which is why the earlier drafts had to go first. The wording follows. Extinction becomes evolution, a massacre becomes an upgrade, and a species gets demoted to a state. One precision, malignant narcissism isn't in any diagnostic manual. It's a theoretical framework describing people who take decades to become what they are. He didn't develop this. He received it complete from the man who wrote him. The horror was never that Ultron malfunctioned. He obeyed exactly, and every word of it was addressed to a father who never read the draft. Look at who he actually fights. Not an empire, not a species, not a rebellion. Kang the Conqueror spends his existence hunting versions of himself, erasing worlds because copies of him are standing in them. Every serious enemy he has ever had wears his face, and he takes no pleasure in it. Chronopolis has no court, no luxury, nothing resembling a reward. An armory he lived inside. That rules out most of what people assume about him. The label that fits is narcissistic personality disorder, grandiose type, and one criterion does almost all the work. A belief that you are unique, that there is nobody like you and could not be. Then the multiverse opens. Forget the theory that the variants mean a fractured identity. They're separate people with separate lives and separate armies. That's cosmology, not a condition. What the multiverse does to him is worse. It manufactures counter-evidence on a loop, proof he's a common outcome, not a singular event. He attacks the evidence until his own variants judge him too dangerous and exile him to the quantum realm. He was condemned by a committee of himself. Then there's Janet. He arrives injured, stranded, sympathetic, and stays good company for 2 years while she repairs his ship. The warmth is real in the sense that it works, and entirely conditional. When the ship shows her what he's done, it evaporates and he threatens her family. Resistance from anyone smaller gets nothing ceremonial. He doesn't punish the rebels in the quantum realm. He removes them, the way you'd correct a clerical error. Defeat doesn't break him. Humiliation does. Scott Lang, the next convict in a shrinking suit, mocks him, and the composure that survived exile collapses in seconds. Losing is survivable. Being made small by someone ordinary is the message the variants already sent him. He tells Janet he was saving the multiverse from his other selves. Self-genocide reframed as protection. The final decision settles it. When escape becomes possible, the whole multiverse is open. Fresh timelines, unclaimed and endless. He goes back to the war against his own copies. He was never conquering territory. The condition itself is a fragile self, rather than a hunger. People who have it are usually more breakable than dangerous, and the rage arrives when the self is threatened, not when something is wanted. Kong's self is threatened permanently by design. The multiverse prints another edition of him every time a timeline opens, and he'll spend eternity trying to recall them all. Kong's war spans all of time and can never be finished. The next man's plan fits inside a year and ends the day it works. Helmut Zemo has no serum, no armor, no ship. He has a printer, decrypted files, and patience. The condition is prolonged grief disorder, only added to the manual in 2022. The film arrived first. It describes grief that stops moving, identity dissolved, numbness, nothing meaning anything. It starts in Sokovia, a colonel with a wife, a son, a father in the countryside. The city lifted and dropped while he's deployed, the bodies found 2 days later. Then he goes to work. The public Hydra dump? A year of forgery and impersonation. No missteps. The comfortable reading is that a grieving father snapped. Fair instinct. The loss is real, and he ends the film wanting to die. Snapping is loud and disorganized. This was a year of flawless paperwork. The competence is the tell. Everything that used to be him is gone, and the mission moved into the vacancy, which is how numb men end up extraordinarily precise. Then Siberia? He puts both of them in a room, one with a shield, one in a suit that could level a building, and never reaches for a weapon. He presses play on old footage and steps back. He never says the word revenge. He talks about empires. One destroyed from outside can rebuild. One that rots from within is finished. Later about gods who shouldn't exist. Every sentence is doctrine. He also apologizes to T'Challa for his father's death. The plan works and the Avengers fracture. When T'Challa finds him, Zemo tries to provoke him into shooting, then turns the gun on himself. That's where the case rests. Nothing waited on the other side of success. The plan was never a route to life after the loss. It was the substitute for one. The condition is common, treatable, and has nothing to do with violence. Most people carrying it are stuck, not dangerous. What Zemo built wasn't a scheme. It was scaffolding around a collapsed building, and the day he finished it, he took it down himself. Zemo authored every step of his own collapse. The next man chose none of it, and the harm never pointed outward. Touch Bob Reynolds and you go somewhere. Not a memory of his, one of yours. Yelena lands back in the Red Room, luring a friend to her death. Walker returns to snapping at his wife while his son cries. Whatever this is, it isn't broadcasting his content. It's reading theirs. Childhood abuse in a household already weighed down by mental illness. Then addiction, isolation, a settled belief that he's worth nothing. A stranger offers him a medical trial. What he walks into is a program to build a replacement for the Avengers. It works exactly as designed. Unlimited power, handed to a man who never believed he deserved a thing. The power tracks how he sees himself. Told he's a hero, he becomes close to a god. When that collapses, so does he. And New York goes dark, people vanishing into shadows burned onto walls. Two names invite two easy answers: dissociative identity disorder, two personalities in one body, or bipolar because of the shape, high then crash. Both fail on the evidence. The first needs a wall between identities, amnesia, lost time, and Bob has none. He knows what the void did, he's present for it, and describes it afterward. The void has no life of its own either. No name, no age, no history. It exists to say one thing. Listen to what it tells him, that he doesn't matter, that believing he could be anything was the shameful part. That isn't a separate person talking. It's a sentence Bob has repeated since childhood, arriving in the third person. Bipolar fails more simply. The highs aren't his, a serum made them, then a woman staged him for cameras. Remove the staging and the euphoria goes too. So what is the film actually depicting? The closest match is complex PTSD, recognized for prolonged, inescapable trauma rather than one event. Beyond the usual intrusions, it adds three things: emotions swinging to extremes with no middle, relationships he can't sustain because he expects to be left, and a self-concept built on shame. That last one isn't a metaphor for the void. In clinical language, it is the void, which explains the strangest scene in the film. Bob attacks the shadow with everything he has, and every strike makes it larger. Shame doesn't behave like an enemy. Fighting it is agreement, so they stop. Yelena walks into the dark, finds him in his worst room, and stays. The others follow, nobody throws a punch, and the city comes back. Trauma, depression, and addiction do not make people dangerous. People living with them are far more likely to be harmed than to harm anyone. The exaggeration here is the power, not the pain. No cure at the end either. A year on, the void still exists, and Bob manages it with people around him. He never needed saving. He needed someone to stay in the room while the worst of it played. And every punch before that was a vote for the thing throwing it. Bob's verdict pointed inward. The last man points his at everyone else and arrives with less evidence than any of the five before because his film hasn't come out yet. Everything we know about Victor Von Doom's interior comes secondhand. Sue Storm describes a man who was the smartest person in any room and kind until everything he loved was taken from him. She thought he was lost, later that he was broken. That's a witness statement, not a confession. Three things circulate as one: what released footage shows, what Marvel has said on record, and a third pile of inference and speculation, hardened into fact in comment sections. Start with the footage. His first words aren't a threat. He warns that something is coming, something that may not be deterred, and that an unthinkable decision waits before day's end. Villains don't usually open by shouldering everyone's survival. Then the poster. Doom stands hands folded before a tapestry of a woman and child above a broken world, ringed with angels. Who they are hasn't been confirmed. That it's a public memorial in a throne room is visible. In footage screened at Comic-Con, he tells the heroes their lives were stolen and must be given back, intercut with every Avenger who has a child holding tighter. The obvious reading: he's the next Thanos. Another loss, another cosmic plan, another calm man doing arithmetic with other people's lives. Thanos never claimed he was owed anything. His argument was that he was right. This one's is that a debt exists and the living hold the payment. One wants vindication, the other wants collection. The pattern that language suggests is paranoid in structure. Others hold what belongs to you. Grudges never discharge. An attack read into ordinary lives and answered in kind. That's roughly 3 of 7 markers from trailers, when 4 is the threshold and trailers aren't a clinical picture. Not a diagnosis, a direction of travel. The real condition isn't a plan for conquest. It's experiencing everyone around you as a threat, and it makes lives smaller, not larger. So what would the finished film have to show? Whether the loss happened or he only believes it did. Whether the entitlement predates it. Whether he can be shown the debt is unpayable and revise. Until then, the evidence supports one thing: a man who refuses to call a loss an accident and has turned a grave into an invoice. So take one of the 5 and replace it. Name the case I got wrong and what belongs there instead. The swap matters more than the objection. Subscribe if the next one sounds worth your time.